I'm Pierre Battah, speaker, author, and trainer in leadership, and I am delighted to have my dear friend and colleague Monique Gallie with me. In fact, I'm with her because this is her space. Great space.
This is our space.
Great space that it is. Monique, I introduce you to everybody as the queen of conflict resolution, but you're so much more. You do so much work from an advisory point of view and a consulting point of view in leadership and in HR. We both have that HR background.
And passion.
Yeah. And I know, I think this topic is one that speaks to you.
Oh, maybe just a bit.
Quite a bit. So let's talk about difficult conversations.
Okay.
This won't be one of them.
You sure?
Oh,
I could put you in that
you
space,
could absolutely
and
put
we'd see
me.
the resistance.
Yes,
and
you'd see me cry.
The awkwardness.
No, you would just make me cry. I would cry. I remember, now this is a few years ago, I distinctly remember driving to northern New Brunswick. And one of the great joys for me was I kidnapped you. You were in the car, and you gave me, this is a number of years ago, probably before, certainly I wasn't talking, teaching, or even hearing a lot about leaders and managers and difficult conversations, right? It wasn't as much in the air, I don't think. You, of course, were already ahead of that curve. And I remember in the car, you were coaching, you were training. I think you were doing a bit of counseling too, but you were primarily helping me learn and understand about difficult conversations, and more importantly, how to do it effectively and with great humanity. Here's my question. I'm curious if you would agree with me. I think there's been an evolution. I think we are now speaking about difficult conversations more. I think leaders and managers are asking for tools in this area. It has now become
acceptable to.
There you go.
Acceptable to start looking at it.
There you go.
Very similar to the vulnerability aspect that Brené Brown gave a few years ago. Yep. So I believe difficult conversations is better accepted so that in order for the leaders to start looking at themselves.
Right.
Now, if you asked me, has the practice improved?
Oh, that's interesting.
That would be a whole different conversation that we would have.
Meaning, we're talking about it more, it's in the zeitgeist, but are you suggesting that skills haven't necessarily, are they better, are they worse, are people curious?
I think it is more evident if people haven't mastered the competency yet.
Right.
And I think that employees, organizations, and communities are looking for leaders with that skill set, because that skill set enables more motivation and more engagement from employees. Sure. So I think it's become something that hasn't become in the past, but it's become more expected from a leader perspective that you can't ignore anymore. Right. But it is one of the most difficult things to do as a leader.
So, and just to be clear, when you think of a difficult conversation, I used to be in the business of helping coach. You've done this work too. We've both helped leaders and managers have what I think someone would believe is one of the most difficult conversations, which is terminating an employee or disciplining an employee, right? Mm-hmm. But difficult conversation doesn't have to be just that. What do you think of when you help me understand the nature of a difficult conversation? What type of conversation? Is it really anything that I find difficult?
For me, a difficult conversation is you being able to speak your truth authentically, being genuine, respecting your space while respecting the other person's space, knowing that you want their greater growth as well as your greater growth.
Right.
So a difficult conversations, I'm going to say there's a spectrum.
Right.
And the spectrum, when you talked about a termination, well, that I'm going to say that is the imposed. Well, you got to have that conversation. Right. Well, maybe in today's terms is how can we avoid that termination, and what other conversations can we have in the meantime, which are difficult conversations that may or may not lead to that. And sometimes I get the question from leaders. I get, okay, so I've spoken my truth a few times and I've talked to employees about their performance and the performance is not improving. How do I know that it's time? And usually my answer is, it depends. It depends if you're asking the questions, you yourself, you're not at peace, that you've done everything in your power for you to close a subject. That means that there's still a you element that you're in conflict with. And what is it in that you element that you need to do to feel more at peace? So sometimes it's a reflection of your coaching skills, your mentoring skills, your ability to offer support to the other person. So there's a you element to it. And that's where I found the fear of conflict, the fear of addressing conflict, is that I, as a leader, am put in those situations that I myself am awkward. So I'm going to meet with the employee that's going to definitely be awkward in the conversation. Then both of us are going to be awkward in the conversation. We leave the conversations being double awkward. And so the fear of conflict usually is what I found that has been difficult for employees, not for employees, for leaders. I have also found in the fear of conflict is I don't want to address the situation because I don't want the relationship with my employee to change. Right. So I felt that maybe it's not as bad as what I think it is. And then they convince themselves that it's not as bad, and then something happens and it gets worse, and it's like, crap, I've got to address it. But I've let it go all these years, so how do I address it now? And I said, well, maybe now is the time to address it. And the how part of addressing it in a way that they feel proud and they feel confident is usually where leaders are struggling, I found anyways.
I think you're right. Before we go to the how, because I do want us to talk about that, I really like how you framed this. You said there are some conversations, I don't want to have the termination discipline conversation, but I have to, right? And so I go into it, right? I don't want to have it, but I'm going to have it, and I'm going to fumble my way through.
So how could I do the best of it with
right. Fair ball. I find it fascinating, the notion, so what that implies is, I have a bunch of conversations that are optional or I don't need to have them, and I can choose whether or not I want to go there or not. And I'm hearing you say, you and I have both seen people who will say, well, this situation calls upon me to put myself in an awkward, uncomfortable, I sort of know what I'm doing, but not really. And I'm going to put some of the tips into action that we'll talk about in a minute. And others, has it been your experience, others just don't, right? They avoid at all costs and things get worse. Yes? Yeah.
What, I usually say to leaders, when you avoid, the resistance gets bigger. Right. And then you'll be faced with a situation where you will have to address it malgré toi.
Yeah.
You'll have to address it because it'll be bigger than what it is.
Right.
And then there may be a part of you that'll feel a little bit bad, that maybe if I would have addressed it earlier, and that's what I found with my leaders. I kind of knew, but I was busy or I was doing something else or my priority was somewhere else. So I didn't address it. And now I feel bad because maybe if I would have addressed it, maybe it wouldn't have been that bad, or maybe they could have shifted. And now it's to the point that they can't. So part of the recommendation that I speak to my leaders about is that we know. Like, let's not let's not tell ourselves lies.
Right. You know that it should be happening.
You know that you need to address
That's really good.
Now, sometimes you choose, I'm going to put that in brackets, you choose not to address it because there's other priorities or other stuff that are more comfortable and that are more in the routine, that are more in the known. Yeah. So sometimes I recommend follow your gut feeling.
That's really good.
And I think what coming back to what you were saying, for those that kind of want to address it or not, if you address it earlier, you're able to master the skill a lot more than when you get it more into intense conversations.
Agreed. So just before we move away from the why people don't go there, just to cap it off, and then let's talk about the how. I'm too busy, which could be a deflection, but could be legit. I don't know how.
That's
legit.
That's a legit.
That's legit, right? And you and I would be sensitive to the fact that increasingly people now at least are open to learning about this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it'll make a difference. Have you heard that? I've had managers say to me, it's not going to make a difference, so why bother?
And with those managers, usually I've found that they have tried to address a situation in their way in the past, and nothing changed.
All right.
So a lot of the times when I get leaders that say, you know what, why address it because it's not going to change, I check in on where's that perception? Right. Does that perception come from, I'm going to say truth, that they've addressed it in the past and the behavior didn't change? And then we go further in terms of, okay, the behavior didn't change, were they accountable to change the behavior? So what was the employee role? What was the leader role as well in terms of how to be consistent after that conversation? Yeah. How to be consistent to ensure that the employee is kind of slightly moving forward. Just we talked about leading change. How do you help the employee lead change through that process?
Yeah. We mentioned, just to cap that, we also mentioned the notion of, so I don't have time, which may or may not be true. I don't know how. It's not going to get, it's not worth it. It's not worth my time and energy, which may be deflecting and avoiding. But to your point, maybe there's been experience there that has led to that. Yeah. So the one that I find that gets added onto that is, and you mentioned it a while ago, but I just want to highlight it, is that I don't want to rock the boat. That the rest of the relationship with this person is going reasonably well, and I don't want to change. So I think we've got the why people don't. So let's move. Let's move to.
Before we move to that, I would just want to add one more element, and I'm going to say power and control. As a leader, it's as if we are expected to be in control and I'm going to say powerful in terms of where the department is going and leading the employees there, and having the leader be in a space of vulnerability and risking and trying new things sometimes is offsetting to the leader. So feeling that they're losing a bit of that control can be destabilizing. So that could be another why that is difficult to have that conversation. So I would recommend there to do more of a check-in with the leader, to do a check-in of why they feel that there's a bit of resistance.
So let's dig into the how a little bit. Somebody comes to you saying, I have to have this conversation. It's not something I'm used to. I'm a new leader manager. Where do you start with people like that?
I think I would start in a place where you would start in your training sessions, a self-reflection. I would start with them on reflecting why it is perceived as a difficult conversation. So that would be one of the first steps that I would do. I would ask a lot of questions because I would want to confirm what is it within that instance that's creating such discomfort or such resistance or such weirdness, I'm going to say. So that would be the first step. That would be one of the hows.
Right.
Now,
where do you go from there?
I think the second step is giving them permission to attempt to do something differently. And sometimes it's to behave differently, and sometimes it's to communicate differently. Sometimes it's to possibly have a different attitude or a different thought process. One of the things that I found in my experience is when leaders believe in employees, the employees go over and beyond. When you get to a difficult conversation, sometimes I've found that leaders are less believing in their employee anymore. So sometimes in a change of an attitude or mindset, I talk about if you believed in that employee again, how would you approach a discussion? And the discussion, chances are, could be a lot different than in their place of resistance.
Okay.
So all of a sudden, you're starting to look at a different shift or a different mindset, a mind shift, I call it.
So your starting point is with the individual in terms of where are they, and in terms of shifting the actual how. Help me with some practical tips.
So some of the practical tips I talk about is they have to be tight on the facts,
Right.
on the what, on the why they're having this discussion, why they're having this difficult discussion.
Right.
So the factual components, the what, and I would say script it out. So that is scripted out so that it's clear to them what the what is. So that would be that would be one of the practical tips. Another practical tip that I would give them is, what is the objective that you want? As well, in this conversation, where do you want to get to? And making sure that the objective is clear. So that would be something specific. The third one that I would factually look at is, what are the potential reactions and how can we disarm conflict, or how can we disarm resistance from an employee level? So having scenarios in terms of, if they reacted this way, how would you react to it? How can you approach it so that you stay on track with the objective? And one of the last pieces as well is never leave the conversation without having a check-in point afterwards. So a check-in within a week or within a few days. So those would be the practical tips that I would offer. So Pierre, in your book on leadership, we just talked about difficult conversations, and on chapter 11 you talked about how do I provide feedback, and especially the difficult stuff.
Yeah.
And you kind of offered gems on page 146. If somebody has the book, you can just flip to that 146. And what would be some gems that you would recommend for when you're having difficult conversations?
And I think you're very gracious. I think the gems largely came from people that I worked with in the workshop, right? Because like you, I say, what's your advice? And I've hung on to some of those. I'm reminded of a quick story. There's a person that I've worked with as a leader, and she tells this wonderful story about how her father was a local pharmacist in a rural community where he knew everybody. And he would, they would decide as a family business that, well, so-and-so, we need to let them go because they're just not performing. And, we've agreed that that's one of the hardest conversations to have. Anyway, he would call the person in, and then he would have a conversation with them that would last quite a while and would take a lot of turns. And then the person would show up to work the next morning because he never, right? Because
the message was so not clear.
His wife would have to pull them aside and say, just in case. So she got in the habit now, when he would have the difficult conversation, she would call them that night to make sure the message. So I think that's one of the pieces, right? Is that you and I have been in those rooms a lot. Yeah. And people will beat around the bush. They won't get direct. So I think the harder it is, probably the more direct we. And I don't mean direct. I don't mean disrespectful or rude, but it's getting to the point. Right, I think for me that's what.
And to add to the getting to the point, yes, I think that you're talking about is clarity.
Yes,
ensuring that you get to the point, but your message is really clear. Because sometimes when people waffle around what the issue is, the message is so not clear that the other person that's receiving the message doesn't have a clue what the intent or what the message is. So that clarity.
And I think adding clarity. I've heard this from lots of people in my workshops, and you practice this, I know, in your work. The notion of use of examples, for example, right? The other quick pieces for me is it's a dialogue, not a monologue. No matter how difficult the conversation, there needs to be a point in which I'm asking questions and involving the person. There are some exceptions to that, right? I mean, termination meetings and so on might be difficult. I think we have some brain science that really explains that if I say to you, Monique, is it okay if I talk to you about your performance in that meeting? Giving you that sense of control right off the bat, where you're actually saying, yes, let's have the conversation. So asking permission, I think is key. I think speaking in eyes, right, and not pulling the you and the finger comes out and all those kinds of things. I think there was some great. One of the books that I always hold up is called Crucial Conversations. You probably know it. Crenny and Patterson wrote, and I think I think you taught me this in the drive to Bathurst many years ago. It's not about who's right.
No.
It's not about blame. These difficult conversations, we need to approach, I think, with very clarity. You mentioned it a minute ago, clarity of intention. Right? This is what I'm trying to achieve. I think role playing difficult conversations is helpful. Mm-hmm. Somebody in your entourage whom you can sit with and say, okay, we're going to role play this, and I'm just going to how I'm going to get started, how I'm going to get to the point, how I'm going to close, right? How I'm going to finish in a way that makes sense. That in my worldview, most of the time I can express my confidence in the fact that you have the ability to overcome whatever this difficulty is. You've done it before, right? I don't think it's about sugarcoating anything, but I do think there's room for us at the end of these conversations to express our belief in the person and our belief in the fact that if they wish, they can overcome this.
I think I'm just bringing you back a bit when you talked about the clarity of the message and asking questions. In that piece, what I found very useful is asking open-ended questions so that both get clear understandings of perspectives. Yeah. Because without knowing where the person comes from and where they're at, getting to the solutions part is more difficult. Yeah. Because then after that, you get into what are the next steps? What is the action plan? What does that look like? And then building the piece at the end that you talked about. Now, I believe in you. I believe in your abilities. Yeah. You've demonstrated it before. So this is just one where we need to evolve the skill set. We need to evolve, but I know you can. Yeah. So let's work together at it. And don't wait for a long period of time before you follow up again.
Yeah, checking in, frequently.
Because if this is really important to the leader, well, the employee is going to look at the leader to say, okay, well, let's schedule. And if the leader doesn't schedule for 3 weeks or a month, all of a sudden the perspective is, well, the manager did that because he had to, not because he wanted to. So do they really care? Because sometimes employees feel good around, somewhat good around that meeting, but then nothing happens afterwards. So that follow-up piece is a piece that I recommend to leaders when you leave, and I spoke about it earlier, when you leave the meeting, make sure that there's a next step and the leader takes the role in creating that meeting because it's important to them. Be the leader or be the model.
Yeah. I think we're underscoring how you start, how you finish is important. Mm-hmm. Just like the Spielberg movie, right? Right? Spielberg always said, what happens in the middle not so big, but beginning. My son was a proctor in a residence. And as a first-year university student, you come on to quite a few situations with kids away from home for the first time. And one of their training was always to clearly establish from the moment you arrive on a situation, I'm here to help. Yeah. Right? You're not in trouble, I'm here to help. And I think there's a lesson there for me for managers, right? Is that the reason we're doing this, the reason we're going to have this conversation is because I believe that I'm here to help. I'm here to help. I believe in your contribution. And I think there's a fellow that I worked with for many years, and he was very wise, and I learned so much from him. And we go into these conversations, and the two things that I learned from him, one was he was prepared to learn something that he didn't know, right? To your point of open-ended questions and dialogue, he was prepared to learn something that might have him adjust the nature of what he was presenting, even to the point where I saw him say, look, we've discussed some things and maybe we should stop here and we should think about where we are. And what he was doing was wanting to rethink his approach because he had learned something he didn't know. Exactly. So the first thing he taught me. The second thing he taught me was this notion of creating some kind of mutual ground, right? The common ground in the agreeing on some things. We both want you to be successful, right? We both want our clients to be well served. So he was always very, very. There's two things I love. I taught from him. Yeah, the common objective. The why was common ground.
The greater good of the why is why we're having the conversation.
Exactly. And I think we said it a while ago that anything you find difficult to talk about is a difficult conversation. Right? Exactly. But I think, would you think they get easier? Do you think, have you seen in your clients as they, maybe if they practice them more, if they, because we talk about how people resist doing them. Have you seen it get easier for people?
I have seen, and I'm going to talk from my perspective, because I've worked a lot with conflict and I've worked a lot with leaders. The more you master the skill,
Right.
the better you're at being proud of yourself at the end of the discussion.
Oh, that's very good.
It doesn't mean that you're never going to have difficult conversations.
Right. Yeah.
But it'll mean that you'll go into the difficult conversation knowing what you want to say, how you want to say it, so that you're respecting yourself and the other person, and you have the clarity around it, and that you have the ability to shift to where it needs to go,
Right.
so that you can get a win-win.
Right.
So that being said, mastering a skill set or mastering a competency doesn't happen in a week, or does it happen in 2 weeks. This is a month, years journey.
Yes.
So yes, people get better at it when they practice it.
Right.
The problem is most want to avoid it. So they don't get to that mastery part.
Right.
And don't want to stay quick enough. Now, something I'm going to leave with, because I know that we're probably getting into the end of our conversation, is my advice to leaders around difficult conversations is courage.
Mm.
Have the courage to have those difficult conversations. Because you believe that having that difficult conversation is going to take energy, but while you're thinking and thinking and thinking about it and driving yourself crazy and that you're not having it, you're actually losing more energy doing that. So have the courage to bring it up and to master the skill set.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.